Welcome to Reimagining the Contact Center, where you can learn from experts that are pioneering the most promising strategies to evolve your contact center operation and take your operations to new heights. I'm your host, Marc Bernstein, and my guest today is Jim Rembach, founder of Call Center Coach, president at Influence to Action, and editor-in-chief at CX Global Media. Last week, Jim and I were talking about leadership in the contact center, and he said something that really struck a chord. He said, you have a lot of people that say that agents are assets and that they don't know how to do anything but treat them as objects. So in this episode, we're going to dig into that. And Jim's going to help us understand why this problem exists, how you should develop your team, and make sure that your agents are delivering exceptional results and are happy and want to stay with you. Jim, welcome. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Now, I can tell you, you just actually teed up a 40-year problem that we need to fix. So we're going to be here a while.
We're going to take that 40-year problem and condense it down to like 40 minutes. Where does it start? Where does the problem start?
As they say, even when you start talking about software development and software products and, being able to find a customer who is a successful customer and client success is when it's not that way, they don't point their finger at you. And they don't point their finger at themselves. They point it at you, right? Same thing applies if you start talking about if I have a metrics problem, if I have a quality problem, if I have a diversity and inclusion problem, if I've got a turnover issue, if I've got a client retention problem, it all starts with the leader. I mean, why? I mean, we kind of see this, play out in some degrees when you start looking at the field of athletics because it gets so much spotlight is, well, what happens when a team doesn't perform? Well, they get rid of the coaching staff. They at least get rid of the head coach. And a lot of times the coaching staff goes along with it. Why do they do that? Why do some of these leaders who have been the most successful, like a John Wooden or a Mike Krzyzewski, or, how come they're the greatest of all time? Because they're exceptional leaders. And those people create exceptional leaders. And that's what's missing.
Yeah. Jim, it's funny because I also understand how difficult it can be to view people as people. And I know that's a crazy thing to say. I'll kind of explain a little more, which is when you are operating any sort of organization at scale, where you're thinking about systems at play and you're thinking about how hundreds or thousands of people all work together in the same direction, it's hard to think about those people and those systems as individuals that have individual needs that you need to take care of as well. What is the right balance, you think, for a leader to be thinking about all of the different people in their organization that they need to serve and that also are serving their customers and their products?
Well, the answer is the higher you go, the more that's your thought, and that's what you do on a day-to-day basis. I mean, that when they start talking about people hitting a ceiling with their career, for most people, it happens right in their mid 40s. And the reason that occurs is if you're building a skill and learning how to become successful at a thing, a business process and activity. I'm in customer service, or I'm in accounting, or I'm in product development, or I'm wherever I may be. Once you hit that level, you've kind of built all of your technical skill. And so for you to get to the next level, you have to be an expert at leading people. And that's a totally different skill set. And so as you get higher and higher and higher up an organization, the more that's what you should be doing day in and day out. It's developing those people below you. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but the ones that report to you to be better leaders, to be more successful. And so when you start looking at how people are breaking up their day in the contact center and developing their people, if I'm a frontline leader, if I'm not using at least half of my time to develop those people, that's a problem, right? And as if I move up, same thing. If I'm not developing my team leads and supervisors to be better team leads and supervisors, and I'm not, devoting at least, 50% of my time, that's a problem. So each percentage ding away from that 50% is going to negatively impact every single KPI you have, period.
One of the things I just started doing personally is doing an analysis of my calendar and looking at all the different meetings and events I have and saying, how am I spending my time? And the categories I broke it down into are organizational excellence, public voice, things like this, customers, product, miscellaneous, and people. And there are some things in my calendar I really wish I could have changed. Like, for example, miscellaneous was something, the average was around 9 to 10 hours a week of miscellaneous meetings that didn't really drive excellence throughout the organization, didn't have any new processes or people that I was investing in, but were just things. But one of the things that I was really excited about is that people was the top category. It was approximately 72 hours a month, either bringing in new people or developing people here. One of the things I think is so challenging is to notice whether you're spending your time internally or externally, because you're getting pulled in both of those two different directions. What should contact center leaders be keeping top of mind when they're thinking about how to make that balance of their time?
Well, it does come back down to looking at it, and I think what you had said a moment ago, we kind of need to come back to is, seeing those people as individuals versus objects, right? Uh, and so that means people are at different starting points. They have different needs. We also not going to get into the discussion and associated with, having the right job descriptions in our hiring process, because that can create some issues. So in other words, if I'm bringing in people who, aren't really positioned to be successful, that creates a whole massive burden on a
Mm.
frontline leader who's not prepared for that. I have to really break it down from an individual perspective. So that means as a frontline supervisor, I need to myself, be developed to where I can actually do that effectively. And so let's look at some statistics associated with that. Um, Development Dimensions International, DDI, they study frontline leaders across a slew of different industries. And while these numbers are generic to some degree, I've seen them play out for the past 40 years in the contact center space. So I've been in the contact center space for over 20. And looking back further, and this whole turnover and morale issue is chronic. It's always been a problem. It's just at certain periods of time, it's just been a more massive problem than others. But if you look at a frontline leader, the average age and tenure that they are when they get their first frontline role, they do not get any type, and I'm just saying any type of leadership development until 6 years after they get in that role. So if I start looking at that, how many agents are getting toasted and burned in that 6 year time frame?
Mm.
That's scary. And so what ends up happening is, if sometimes, people never get in. And so if they do survive, it's a survival mechanism, and they get to the next level, well, if they've not ever had any type of leadership development, do you honestly think that they are going to think that their people need it? Well, I didn't get it. Why do they need it?
Mm.
Right. And the fact is, when you start talking about leadership development, I mean, it's much like being a doctor or a lawyer. Why do lawyers and doctors say that they're in practice? Because they're learning their entire career. It's a lifelong learning. When you're a leader, you have that same, quite frankly, responsibility. You're responsible for the health and welfare and well-being of the people who report to you. And if you don't take that seriously by committing yourself to lifelong learning, how in the heck are you ever going to make an impact in other people's lives? And when you start looking at the attributes of successful leaders, that's number one, is that I want other people to be successful, and I help them to do that. I have to have that commitment. And so if you don't have it, get out of a leadership role. I mean, go do something where you can be an individual contributor, and don't, try to aspire to be someone who's in that leader role, because you should not be it.
One of the interesting things I think that you just mentioned is that, if you're waiting 5 years or so before, on average, you're getting any sort of promotion or recognition, and you have all these agents getting toasted. Well, if you take the average contact center attrition rate, which you hear industry standards is around 1 year retention, for an agent or so, depending on your organization. Does that mean that you're going through 5 cohorts of agents and you get to see 5 whole cohorts of agents come and go before you've had the chance to get promoted and rise through the ranks? I can imagine that that's a lot of seeing churn and burn in the organization, where by the time that you're in a position of leadership, it might be very difficult to imagine anything other than, a cohorts of agents coming and going all the time.
Yeah, it makes it hard. Nobody could be successful in that environment. And so you've seen, or I've seen, different levels and fluctuations in regards to that number. Some organizations have, single digit, turnover rates. Some are in the triple digits, mid-range, 3, 4, 500%. When you throw in a learning curve and all that, that can mean, a huge issue. And so you kind of have to look at, where you are with your own organization and what you're responsible for and what you're going to decide to do. Because going back to that whole scenario of if that company can't use your tools effectively, they don't blame themselves, but they need to. So if I'm having some issues with turnover, I need to look at me, not anything else other than that. I mean, start there. And you can do that as a frontline leader. Frontline leader can say, okay, do I have the best team with the lowest turnover? If I don't, why? Right? What am I doing, or what can I do differently in order to make sure that doesn't happen? So for me, when I was younger, in my younger age in operations, I mean, I had one of the highest retention teams, but the problem was I was young and really didn't know what I was doing as far as why I was getting that number. I mean, because it is an outcome, right? But when I reflect back now that I have some age, it's like I was doing some things that I just wasn't taught. But I just did them because they were just part of my nature and how I grew up and those types of things. And they were, effective. I mean, I remember one time sitting in a what do they call a legal scenario deposition. Thank you. I was sitting in a deposition where I was a manager that was churned, and I was sitting and they were trying to. There was a lawsuit that came up as a discrimination lawsuit, and they were trying to the person who was trying to defend the employer was essentially attacking me. And that's what they want to do in a deposition, because they want to discredit me, so I become someone who doesn't have impact.
Ugh.
And I had never been through that experience before, so that was new. And so I was just answering the questions, and because they were, and then after they went through that line and they did not accept me as to be a hostile witness, I was just answering his questions. Then they started talking about my retention numbers and my performance numbers and stuff while I was there. And I was like, I didn't even know that. And they said, well, obviously, this person who I actually resigned, and what happened to me because I couldn't stand. There's no way I knew I could lead in that environment. It was hostile to me too. But yet while I was there, I performed. And then they actually, when I left, I found out a day later they settled out of court. So it's, who are you and who are you going to be? Now, as I've continued to try to go down this path, I became certified in emotional intelligence and created the Call Center Coach Academy. I also use that to help others when it comes to their, digital marketing and growth. Like, for example, I just did a test on LinkedIn where we increased engagement 726.93% on some of the content that we were using for marketing purposes. And it's like, well, how did we do that? Well, we did it because we were connecting with people in our content, and it made all the difference. If you can connect with your people, whether they're customers or whether they're employees, and how you go about doing that, the success is just a bounty.
Let's take it back to people strategy for a second. If you're trying to define your pillars as an organization, what are the core tenets of a good people strategy in a contact center organization?
Well, what we do at the Call Center Coach Academy is we've researched this, and we looked and identified 6 different competencies. Now, when you start talking about adult learning, there's competencies, and we build skills based on those competencies. So competencies are your bedrock, right? And we've identified 6. And again, this has been studied for a long time. I've had a lot of experts look at this. Matter of fact, one of my competitors at Call Center Coach recently exited, well, not never recently, but a few years ago, exited the company that she owned. And I'd known her for a long time, and I introduced her to what we were doing at Call Center Coach. She goes, oh my gosh, this is exactly what we need in our industry. How can I help you? She's done webinars for me, case studies and white papers. And so these 6 core competencies we know are solid. And they are staff development, results orientation, communication and change management, customer service and sales, collaborative relationships, and then business acumen. If I can improve my ability to be successful in those particular competencies, then I'm going to be a better coach. I'm going to be a better mentor. I'm going to be a better trainer. I'm going to be a better leader. And those are all different roles. And that's another thing that people aren't ever taught. It's like there's a difference between a coach and a manager. There's a difference between a coach and a leader. There's a difference between a trainer, and a mentor. And having them to have that understanding and then therefore know where they are in that journey and that path to success is really the starting point.
When I hear you break the people strategy into those 6 core competencies, the first place my mind goes is, can I measure it and set a baseline? So, how should an organization start benchmarking how they're performing in each of those strategies or in each of those competencies?
Well, I mean, we actually do have a tool for that that helps people to measure those things. And anybody can go to callcentercoach.com/VIP and get access to a lot of those things that are listening and or watching. The point being is that, and not to sound, not this, I want to make sure this comes out right. Most of us have not had the opportunity to be developed in the way that we really should be developed to impact and affect this 4-decade plus problem, right? So you're not going to score well. You're not going to.
What's that way,
that's
Jim?
okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
What's that way? What's the thing we're missing?
Oh, well, I'm talking about in those 6 core competencies, and to have it into a systematic approach like that and to treat it like it's a lifelong journey. So if I start looking at, for example, what most organizations do with their leadership development program is, they go through whatever, either a 4-day or a 4-week, whatever course it is, and you get this certificate. Well, I hate to tell you that in March 2020, that certificate had a whole lot of issues associated with it that now need to be changed, right? I mean, us going to remote, being forced to remote, now working in a blended environments, I have to learn different skills as a supervisor in order to affect and impact, retention and engagement and performance. And if I'm not doing things differently, I just basically just took it, remote, that's a problem. So that certificate is not enough. It's a lifelong journey of learning. And so what we do at Call Center Coach, having in a blended learning environment, every single week, we're putting in brand new, fresh content. We're taking information from people as they're going through their struggles, and we're feeding that back into the learning journey because it has to be real, relevant, and what's impacting me today. And if it's a static learning program, that's a problem. Also, if you don't give your people the opportunity to commune with other peers that are not just in your environment, you're missing out a massive opportunity as far as the way adults learn. Adults learn better in community with one another. And so why do I say not within your own organization? Most organizations, there's a fear component. And the fear component can come from self, meaning I don't want other people to see that I'm not good at that, right? Especially if I'm in a leader role, right? And I'm a young leader. And I've even seen older leaders do it. I jokingly said I've had the blessing in my life to lead 19-year-old men and 65-year-old boys. So there's a difference in that we need to be totally aware of when it comes to knowledge and then actually what's happening and closing that knowledge and skill gap. Am I a better leader because I went through this static course and I had their certificate? I hate to tell you, no, you don't. That's a false sense of security. And it's not something that you actually want to use as a determinant on whether or not somebody's going to be a successful leader. It's whether they're committed, they're continuing to learn, they're adapting, they're changing, and they're supporting their people as individuals, not objects.
I think that's one of the reasons that piece that you mentioned about business acumen, that competency about business acumen is so important, is I think that a lot of agents might think or feel, oh, well, that's off limits for me. I don't really need to know that. I just need to know the script, or I just need to be able to handle these cases. But there seems like there's an empowerment aspect. If you can understand how the business functions as a whole and how the customer relationship matters to the business and what the modification or monetization is of that, That's really powerful. Is that, what are some of the other things you notice behind that business acumen component? Is it just the agency to the agent, or is there something more behind that?
There is more. And one of the things when you start talking about those 6 competencies and which one is often the most deficient, it is that one. It's business acumen. So in other words, when I start even looking and thinking about KPIs and key performance indicators, there's a big difference between understanding, cause and effect. There's a big difference between understanding whether or not something can be impacted and affected as an individual contributor, versus an overall team metric. So I worked for an academic where we measured the customer experience. I worked for 15 years. That's how I learned to do, digital marketing and sales, because I created online courses and do everything to educate people about measuring the voice of the customer. And when you think about VOC and measuring that voice of the customer, how much do your KPIs really impact, that voice, right? So if I'm sitting there and I'm focusing in on driving a particular metric, how is the customer going to feel that, right? Is it going to cause a referral and a connection and a repeat business, or is it going to cause a defection? What does that one customer being retained mean? Well, what is the cost of an escalation and its impact? How does the agent themselves impact in the overall picture and mix for the entire company? All of these business, acumen and business related, components are critically important for somebody to understand if they're going to make a bigger impact for the business and feel that they're part of something bigger than just that one particular call or interaction that I took care of.
Mm-hmm. I think that since a lot of organizations, and I understand why, view training as a cost, which is I'm pulling agents off the phone. I am taking all of these agent hours and the wages and dedicating it toward training. And the second that training is done, the better. I think that since some organizations have that perspective, and of course, there's a lot of pressure to keep those costs down, it can be very difficult to justify teaching business acumen, because it's almost, the results of it are intangible. What would you tell an organization that's like, I don't have time to teach agents business acumen. I just need them to do their jobs.
Very little in our lives is actually intangible. And that's what I've come to learn as I've gotten older and worked with an academic. And the fact is, our biggest issue is that we just don't know how to measure it. So if I start talking about that response that you may get, well, what that is, that's a C-level executive who's not enlightened, who's just managing to the budgetary numbers. So like, for example, if I was enlightened, I wouldn't be a CFO who says, well, I'm not going to give you any more people until you lose people. Well, what about the learning curve, right? I've got an 8-month learning curve before somebody becomes competent in doing the particular job. How many customers do you think are going to get impacted by that? Well, we're going to have a potential customer churn rate of 15% because we're not enabling people to come on ready to go, right? So as a leader, I need to understand that financial impact of having that decision be taken place by the CFO. So I need to learn how to speak their language. So if you're sitting there and telling me that I have to wait till I get below this number, yet you're telling me I'm going to have increased volumes and all of that, who's going to get impacted and affected? Well, it's your customer. Okay, so what is the cost of that customer interaction, right? What is that cost of escalation? Our escalations went up by 15% because we're not able to serve customers we want. They're waiting long. You've got to be able to turn that into some financial terms so that you can speak to that, that financial decision maker, and really don't tell them, you ask them questions. So in other words, well, we can do that, but, is it okay with you if we lose 15% of our customers because of that? I don't think they're going to agree to that.
I can't imagine they would. It One of the things that's it seems like is changing is that there's of course dynamics that are empowering the agent today, like the remote contact center where they could essentially pick up and move jobs across the country immediately if they are able to find the contact center with the highest pay. So there's that empowerment aspect. There's also the transition of cost center to profit center, which I think is happening slowly, very slowly, but still happening broadly across the contact center space. And then it seems like one of the things that maybe is reducing agent power a little bit is globalization, because now there's this global workforce that essentially gives you as an individual a little bit less bargaining power to find the absolute best role for you, because it at a certain level it may make sense for the organization from a cost perspective to be moving things near shore or offshore. Do you think we're seeing overall a more empowered agent or a less empowered agent, and what's behind it, you think?
Okay, so there's a couple things associated with what you just said, and artificial intelligence, is absolutely replacing some people in the contact center, but we have to also look at what is being replaced, right? So, and we also have to look at what are the opportunities that open up as a result of that, right? So, if we're talking about customer retention and we're talking about relationships being important and referrals being important, well, that in itself translates inherently to higher skill sets that are required by the human beings that are actually handling those interactions, because the AI is going to take out the simple stuff, right? So now if I'm talking about best choices for agents, best opportunities, the best will always receive the best opportunities. That's just the way that it always has worked, and it always will, right? So if I want to make sure that I'm working for the organization that I want to work for, then I have to make sure that I am continuing to improve my skills. Again, it's the lifelong learners that are going to inherit, all of the wealth, right? It's the lifelong learners that are not going to sit there and at a retirement age and say, "Gosh, I have nothing in retirement or savings, and guess what? That Social Security, that's not going to do anything for me. It no longer can even buy that loaf of bread," right? So those who are continuing along this path and journey of trying to up my skills to the next level are the ones that will have the choices. And if I look at it from a customer perspective, I don't want lower level skilled people to handle my complex problem. So is it, and then that may be a tough thing to say, but that's business acumen, right? The business acumen is to understand complexities, relationships, retention, all of those things associated with, why is that person who is performing well so important to our organization, and do they know it?
I have this picture that I have not been able to get out of my head, and I don't really know if the contact center space is going to trend in this direction or not, but it's the image is vivid, and it's this contact center agent as a concierge. And it's when you think about the futuristic movies, and someone taps their brain and then they immediately connect to a hologram. It says, "Hi, my name is Mrs. Smith. Nice to meet you. How can I help you?" And they're always like the background is glowing, and it's like this light blue glowing background in the hologram. Um, that's at least what the media has painted. These sort of context interactions could move toward. And the thing is, I think that people want that. I think that customers want that when they're working with an agent, the agent really does feel like a concierge, that the agent feels like a truly knowledgeable, buttoned up expert in whatever that area is, because otherwise they talk to a machine. So a piece of me believes that the era of the best agents, that the best agents are about to enter their career prime, where opportunities are going to open up that they've never had before to be working with customers on that level.
That's true. And it goes back to what I was saying, full circle, and that they continue to, to improve their skills, that they'll also be leading those people if they choose to. And here's one of the things that we've also done as a big mistake in our industry: is your best agent is not your best supervisor. That's not the case. And so, we need to understand that, skill is not the same when I start talking about an individual contributor versus somebody who's leading others. Skills need to develop regardless of where people are. Those competency components. Some people, are just don't have the competencies, or they're at such a starting point that it's going to take a significant amount of time for them to get where we need them to get, from a leadership perspective. And being able to assess that is critically important. So one of the things about what you're talking about is an issue, and it will be, and it always has been, is that the pay scale is not commensurate with that. So in other words, it takes a while for that pay scale to catch up. That just means that those people who are the best of the best um, will find those organizations that understand that and close that gap, and that's where they're going to end up.
I wonder, and I want to look this up for a future podcast. I wonder how much an Apple genius makes if you're an Apple genius at the Apple store. Because I just think it's a brilliant model. You know that every company, your direct interaction with the customers, everyone's a genius. Um, and I could imagine the contact center at some point having a pay scale like that if the agents can bring that level of expertise.
And some companies have modeled with that. So
Mhm.
Jamie Siminoff, I had the opportunity to interview him. Jamie Siminoff was the creator and founder of Ring, which was subsequently acquired by Amazon. And at the time when I met him, they were actually doing some testing within their contact center that was in alignment with what you're talking about. And basically, these agents, even though they were still agents, were a little bit more self-managed, and they made a salary. They made a very high wage, and what they were doing is testing all the things that you're talking about. Did they serve customers better? Did they retain customers better? Was the cost to have them, even at that pay scale, beneficial? And at the time, he said, it is.
Hmm. And how many years ago was that, Jim?
Oh gosh, that was probably 4 or 5 years ago now.
Hmm. I'd imagine that's actually only gotten more true then.
Well, and I don't know how they continued the test, because I do know at the time they were of a certain size, and now they've just kind of blown it out. And
Yep.
unfortunately, when you start looking at the traditions, and that's a problem for us,
Yeah.
as we look back at, well, we used to always do it that way, or we've never done it that way, and unfortunately, it stifles our growth.
It's also tough to scale that. Just simply from a recruiting perspective, when you're looking at your list of potential applicants, um, I have to imagine at a certain point, depending on obviously your size, you're hiring enough people that um, paying everybody top dollar and trying to only find like truly outstanding agents can be difficult. Where I think a lot of folks, will say, we'd love to settle, so to speak, for a 50 to 75th percentile agent, even though I would be very interested to hear what happens when your organization with all 90th percentile agents. Like, what does your customer experience look like then?
Well, and I think that's where the business acumen comes into play, because I could say, guess what? Well, maybe pre-COVID, I was kind of restricted because of all these people I had to find within my geographic region. Not anymore. I mean, if I'm talking about a potential candidate pool of, a couple 100,000 people, oh yeah, I can staff for that.
Hmm. Jim, I'm curious. One of the things that I think the contact center space is reckoning with is how they're going to be a good player in DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion, going forward. Obviously, last year was a year that was top of everybody's minds. And I think the contact center space, in so many ways, had so much on our plates with the going remote and the cloud transformation that perhaps less progress has been made in that area than in other industries. And I know that you've been having conversations around that. What are your thoughts on DEI in the contact center nowadays?
And I be honest with you, I don't think I would single out the contact center as far as this goes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would not. I mean, it's societal in nature. It's in all different types of organizations and all different geographic locations. I'm working with somebody right now where we're in development of creating an app that helps organizations to perform better in diversity, inclusion, and equality. And because there's it's a new space, quite frankly. And this person who is actually the lead architect on all of this, the thought leader, talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion being a skip. And I was like, what are you talking about? He goes, it's a skip. And I'm like, help me understand what you're talking about as far as it being a skip. And he said, it's something we skipped 20 years ago when it came to leadership development. Now we're trying to play catch up. I was like, oh, that's unfortunately true. And so even when you start talking about the competencies that we already referred to, and I'm starting to talk about, communication and change management, I'm starting to talk about collaborative relationships. If I'm not effective at DEI, Now we get back to the whole same silo problem. We get back to the whole same, motivation and employment. It's a vicious circle. So I'm looking forward to actually being part of, developing and making that app available. And if anybody's interested in, learning more about that app, just connect with me on LinkedIn and I'll be happy to share that with you.
What are the first one or two steps look like? If you say, okay, uh, it's time for us to start investing more in DEI, what are the first one or two steps look like there?
All right. So you and I even talked about this is, when it comes to, product development and solution selling and, is that anything that we do when it comes to transformation starts with self-assessment. It all does. I mean, we have our own biases and certain perspectives about where we are, but it may not be the truth. And here's the thing. We may say, well, gosh, I at least get 80% of it right. And that is okay. Yeah, you probably could get it 80% right if you have a good understanding and are able to do that self-assessment. But it's the 20% that's going to knock you out and put you out of business. That's a huge variable. I don't think anybody's going to run their business based off of 20%, risk of failure. That's not what we do. We need to minimize the risk, right? So it starts with a self-assessment. And so going through that particular process involves all levels of the organization, because what we may be conveying when we start talking about our mission, our vision, our purpose, and all of these things that, especially we're at a top, senior level, we may be saying, well, this is our customer experience and this is what we do. Well, by the time it filters all the way down to the front line, that ain't what's happening. I mean, I call it an organizational decapitation, and people are like, oh, that's gross. But put it in perspective. If
That
the
is
head,
gross.
it is. But if you think about the head of the organization, and I want it to be impactful. If you think about the head of the organization, thinking we're moving one particular direction, and the feet aren't getting there, and they're maybe even going the other direction, we have a decapitation problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if that's what's going to help you remember, great. But we've got to find alignment so that frontline person, when we're talking about the mission, the vision, and the purpose of the organization, does that frontline purpose understand what they do day in and day out with each interaction and how it aligns?
I think that decapitation problem is truly one of the biggest, if not the fundamental challenge of the contact center, is that direct line of what gets decided and what gets generated and understood, and the insights that occur at the top layer of the organization, having total alignment all the way through the customer interactions. We're right there on the phone or in the chat. The way that the C levels were envisioning that this experience feels like and looks like and sounds like is actually happening right there on the floor.
That is the massive problem, because everybody who is in the middle is focused in on process, procedure, and control and quality, right? Right. So when you start talking about that filtering mechanism and getting through that, that's where the problem exists. So that me as a leader, I need to be aware of that. And I need to say, okay, I know this is coming from up above. I have to make sure that the message and anything else associated with it doesn't get muddied, so that people are on the front line sitting there and saying, you're telling me to give an excellent customer experience, but you're telling me to do it in 2 minutes and 3 seconds. What?
Mm-hmm.
What? That's a disconnect,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so anytime things like that occur, when you look at what is being messaged and then what am I measuring and holding people accountable to, and that's a whole other discussion that I don't want to get into, because I don't talking about a visual. When we say holding people accountable, my visual is usually hands around the throat. That's not the one we want to project, right? So it's, how do we make sure that they don't sit there and say, what you're making me do or telling me I need to do is not in alignment and congruent with what the top levels of this organization say that we're supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm. And it actually goes back all the way to the first topic we were talking about today. The that sense of autonomy and agency, and being able to have some sort of control over your own destiny. It's interesting because that middle layer focused on filtering and processing control also probably could use more autonomy in their role to be, expanding how they think and what they're thinking about to be elevating their careers, one step above. So, if they were, taking business acumen and putting that into practice, and strategy, and putting that into practice, which I think, by the way, a lot of great folks in the middle organization are. But if that were happening consistently, I can imagine that being a huge opportunity for contact centers, not to simply just maintain what happens from top to bottom, but to actually, as it goes at the org, enhance it and enrich it with the different thoughts and perspectives of the middle leadership.
Okay. Now, for that to work, inherently, you have to be a learning organization, because here's a combination that is deadly, and that is having autonomy and low skill. So if I'm giving people to have freedom to make decisions and do whatever they feel that they need to do, and they don't have skill and understanding, your risk level just was blown out of the water as far as that 20% goes. You're now at 40,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you have to really look at, okay, what are the elements and the components necessary in order for me to be able to make that a reality? And to make that a reality, it is having that commitment to being a learning organization. But then when I'm a learning organization, I'm also focused on retention. So that means I'm trying to build depth. I'm trying to build knowledge. And if I'm churning people, I'll never get there, right? So that means I need to have essentially a hub, of experts and knowledgeable people that are always focused in on developing others.
Hub, I love that. I think that's the right visual too, is this sort of central um, locus for the company where the customer interactions and the agent experience and agent interactions flow in. So does the interactions from senior leadership, and that they're able to, put those things together and learn from them and channel out insights for the full org.
Yeah, it's like I said, we can easily say that we need to do that, but it's how you get there is where the problem exists. And this is why so many organizations fail at transformation miserably,
Hmm.
is because of all that middle layer stuff that's going on. And then you have a whole lot of low skill, much like I talked about the whole leadership thing. We have leaders that become leaders, but yet we're never developed as leaders. Well, whoa. And then why do we have a 4-decade problem of turnover and morale? I mean, it begets itself.
Jim, what is your vision for what the contact center of 2030 will look like?
I think we're going to continue to accelerate down this path of having, very high skill people who've been around. And this kind of may cause people to be a whole lot of, counterintuitive. It's like, because we say, hey, people are jumping from job to job. They're only lasting a year or two, and then they're moving on to another. I think you're going to see that pendulum swing back, and it's because of high skill. Right. So in other words, I need to retain those people that have that deep knowledge. And you may say, well, we can just pack all that stuff into AI. You still need to have a human being in order to be able to do the interpretation that the AI technology that currently exists today just can't do. Now, will it ever get to that point to being essentially, that overall knowing being that can understand, the nuances of humanity and all the emotions that are associated with it? I don't see that in my lifetime. Maybe that'll happen in somebody else's, but not mine.
Jim, thank you so much for joining us today. This was wonderful.
I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Appreciate you, buddy. Talk soon.